Hello and welcome to the Prescribing Prosperity podcast with your host, John and Alex Soutsos. Gentlemen, I can't even begin to tell you how excited I am about this podcast that you have planned for today. But let me welcome you first. It's good to see you both again.
Likewise, Bill. Always good to see you.
Great to see you, Bill.
Yeah, the reason I'm so excited about this particular podcast is it is on a topic that I am deeply passionate about, and that is energy. Importantly, affordable energy. And as a matter of fact, I don't know if you all know this or not, but for 2 or 3 years, I wrote an energy column for Forbes Online. I care that much about energy. So I'm excited to hear what your guest, Dan McTeague, has to say today about affordable energy. And on that note, Alex, I'm going to turn it over to you. The floor is yours.
Sounds great, Bill, and thank you very much, Dan, for joining us today. For those who don't know, Dan is widely known around Canada as the Gas Man, and so Dan, I'm gonna kick things off by asking you to tell us how you came by that nickname.
It happened in the mid 1990s when a couple of gas stations in my own riding ran into some trouble. And in one case, someone I had known for many, many years had to close down their shop and couldn't figure out why. And they pointed across the street, said, we have this brand, Esso. And across the street, they built a brand new facility. Gas prices were 15 cents cheaper at the new facility, even though it cost more to administer, and had a number of employees. It was not, publicly or privately owned, and it wasn't a corporate store. And as I sat with them closing up the shop, it dawned on me that they weren't the only ones, and we had other examples of small independents literally being put out of business, and through something called price inversions. And so I began a little bit wider study in terms of why prices were going the way they were going, and determined that we had a problem with the Competition Act that basically was written in such a way that allowed large corporations to crush small business. So I wrote a report back in 1998 and made several changes to the Competition Act, some of which were never implemented, but some which were, including rebates, GST rebates for Canadians and home heating and things like that. But nothing critical that would have at least prevented what was a decline in the number of players. So that led to some setbacks. And the setbacks were actually an opportunity to basically say, well, Imperial Oil calls the shots when it comes to pricing fuel. I might as well try to predict that and give that to consumers before they do. It was very effective, far more effective than any legislative prescription that I might have had or might have been supported at the time. And ever since then, going back to about 1997, 1998, I've been predicting gas prices pretty much across most of the country, usually the major cities. Of course, variations of what I've been in. I did as a member of parliament. Afterwards, when my time was ending as an MP, under tomorrow's gas price a day, continued that with Gas Buddy, and I continue that today, called gaswizard.ca. But Alex, it's not really meant only for gas price prediction to save people money. It's also to help inform people of the policies behind energy and why it's so important.
Well, that's great. That's great that you're doing that, Dan, and that you've been doing it for so many years. So let's go back. I just want to actually touch a little bit more upon that situation that you're describing there. So, what was Imperial Oil, and as it's known here in Canada, Esso, doing specifically? So, my assumption would be they open up a new location, and they basically undercut the competition for whatever extended period of time you want to call it, 6 to 12 months, until they basically bleed them dry, and then. Is that how they eliminate their surrounding competition until it's just the larger corporate players left?
There was a move in the 1980s, late 80s, early 90s to discipline independents, because independents were the ones that brought in the C-stores. The independents were the ones that brought in the car washes. They were creative, and they were also working on sweat equity. So their retail margins were a little bit less than the corporate stores, which had to pay for the staff, had to pay for all of those things. And of course, when someone's putting in their own sweat equity, they could beat the big players at their own game. The problem was that those stores, those corporations had the ability to make money turning crude into gasoline. They call it the crude to rack spread. And that was usually, 10, 15 cents a liter. That allowed them to cross-subsidize any losses they had at retail in order to snuff out not just their branded independents, but also other independents as well. It created a lot of havoc in the industry, and we saw, almost a decade to maybe two of gas price wars, where you would see gas prices in the morning drop well below what it costs to even turn on the electricity, turn on the pumps to get the gasoline. And there were times in the late 70s, 80s, and 90s where gasoline could be had for as little as 10 cents a liter. I know it sounds crazy, but there's a lot of people who remember those days. And that was in of itself, the consumer sees as, hey, give me gas price for nothing, I'll be happy. Except that it tends to distort the markets, and that it did, because once the independent were run out of town, we often saw the price would move right back up and back to levels that were very uncomfortable for most.
Right, right. That makes sense. So before I want to get into your methodology a little bit, but before we do that, let's talk about your career a little bit. So give us a little bit of a background into your career journey, Dan, and how you ended up today where you're at as the president of Affordable Energy Canada.
I've always been an activist within the former Liberal Party. I say the former Liberal Party because it was a party of the center when I was there from 1974 right up until 2012, 2013. Had worked in the private sector, a little bit of work with the Royal Bank, media relations. Later on, more determined after university to work in that field of public relations, media relations, fluently bilingual. So I wound up with Toyota Canada and Lexus, and worked with them for about 5 years before finally getting a shot at running with the blessing of the leader of the party at the time, Jean Chrétien, and became a member in 1993 for a riding called Ontario. You can imagine it was named the County of Ontario. They hadn't changed the name since before Confederation, and so whenever media would look up a new member for Ontario, they would actually come to my name. So it gave me a little bit more media presence than I could probably than most of my colleagues at the time. But I stayed on in various capacities, energy, and then later on, of course, in foreign affairs, doing a lot of work on consular affairs with Canadians stuck in harm's way in many places around the world post 9/11.
So just to provide a little bit of clarity for our audience that's not in Canada, Dan was a member of Parliament at the federal level, the equivalent of someone who's a member of the House of Representatives in the United States. And he represented a riding in the province of Ontario, which is the largest province in Canada, the equivalent of a riding within a particular state, like New York State. So I just wanted to provide a little bit of context there, so people who are not Canadian are getting a better understanding of who you were. So you were a representative in public office, and you journeyed through with the Liberal Party, which is the equivalent in the U.S. of the Democrat Party, or what used to be the previous Democrat Party, not the current version, similar to the way the Liberals used to be, different than they are today. So I hope that provides some clarity.
Yeah, John, very good. And to add to that, in Canada, we have the ability for some representatives to become members of the executive branch, usually appointed by the President of the United States. In Canada, you can have both a member of Parliament and quite often, an executive member. So I was also responsible for Canadians abroad, for which I received my honorable Privy Councillor title in Cabinet, representing a dimension of foreign affairs. So a little bit of a quirk with our system, our parliamentary system, that differentiates us a little bit from the Americans. But important to note, there's wearing two hats was very interesting: the legislative responsibility as well as the executive responsibilities.
Absolutely, that's fascinating. I don't know if we're gonna have time to unpack that today, but I'd love to learn a little bit more about that if we do have some time. But let's shift back over to the focus on your title as the gas man and the work that you did there. So Dan, I don't want to force you to give away all of your secret sauce, but what is the broad strokes methodology that you use in order to be able to interpret and predict where gas prices are going and how these major companies are going to build their pricing?
Nothing really secretive about it. I had a couple of inquiries over 10 years as to how it's done. Someone thought actually one of the oil companies was kind enough to provide me the information, but it's easily gleaned by going to any one of the sources that tracks gasoline on any given day, as well as other energy commodities. My favorite at the time was OPIS, the Oil Price Information Service. They provide a snapshot every minute of market prices, and that multiplied by the value of the Canadian dollar, add the taxes at any given jurisdiction, and it's going to happen in 48 hours from now. So on a day like today, I haven't looked at it yet, a day like today where you're looking at prices that might be up or down, it really depends on what where the market is heading. I saw gasoline was up maybe half a penny, equivalent, about 1.5 cents a gallon US. So all that is put together. It's no magical formula, and it doesn't always fall in every city. Many cities don't respond to any type of increase or decrease on world markets, even though the rack price or the price that they purchase their fuel at changes, especially in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta. I mean, they could stay for weeks same price, even though markets fluctuate. That is not the case in places like Ontario, Toronto in particular, GTA, Ottawa, Vancouver, or Montreal, where it does change based on what the markets are, usually 48 hours after.
And that's a function of the fact that we don't have the same. We're bringing in all of our oil from outside. We don't have any locally stored supply here. Is that the reason?
Well, you have oil. Yes, you have oil right to Montreal. The Line 9 brings Alberta oil right into Ontario and Quebec.
Okay.
Only the Maritimes brings in oil from various places around the world. That would be, the refinery in St. John, which is in New Brunswick, or owned by Irving currently. So most of the oil that we have in Canada is used by Canadians, and most of the gasoline that we use here, generally speaking, is produced in Canada. Our refineries not only make enough for ourselves, there's always a bit of a surplus, but there are a bit of trade back and forth. Sometimes we'll bring in premium gasoline from the United States, from Washington State, while we'll sell regular gasoline from Vancouver or from the Trans Mountain Pipeline, the existing Trans Mountain Pipeline, from Edmonton into the U.S. Pacific Northwest market. So there's a bit of a back and forth. There's almost seamless now, but generally speaking, Canada is a net energy exporter when it comes to fuel like diesel, gasoline, and of course oil.
So then, what's the reason then for Alberta and basically the prairie provinces not being so their prices not fluctuating to the same degree as ours do here in Ontario or Quebec, for example?
I think it's just a practice that we've seen evolve over the years where although we are price takers and the price is always established in the United States. Like, for instance, there are 3 markets in the United States that influence prices in Canada. Ontario, Quebec, Maritimes, or Atlantic Canada, is influenced by the New York Mercantile Exchange, or NYMEX, as they refer to it as, or the New York Harbor price, some will refer to it as. The spot price for gasoline, diesel is for Manitoba, a slice of northwestern Ontario, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and all the BC interior, or central BC, influenced by the Chicago spot market, CME. And Vancouver's prices really depend on the Pacific Northwest market out of Oregon. So that's where we get our price signals from. Whether gas stations, accept them or not is really up to them. Most do shift with these changes, but some in Alberta, in particular, Calgary and Edmonton, just wait until the bitter end due to competition, as well as the fact that they have 3 massive refineries in Edmonton that allows them to maybe play a little bit with their refiner-owned operations so they can compete against each other.
Okay, very good.
Then, on the subject of refineries, my understanding has been that Canada lacks enough refineries, and that is a reason why our gasoline prices are as high as they are relative to the United States, especially pre-Biden presidency. Gas prices in the United States were materially lower than they were in Canada, and so. Can you elaborate a little bit on what role the refineries or lack of refineries in Canada play in our gasoline prices, and why a country as vast as ours, with as many resources as ours, are we paying such incredibly high gasoline prices?
John, the easy question, and it's not always easy to come by because a lot of people don't really think of this very often, but there are 3 factors that differentiate the Canadian prices from U.S. prices, and we do have enough refinery capacity to meet our needs. Give an example, I mentioned the Irving plant in New Brunswick, the largest in the U.S. Northeast and Eastern Canada, supplies a lot of the U.S. Northeast, so Washington, Boston, New York markets. Without that refinery, we'd be in a lot of trouble, so would they. The big difference in prices comes down to taxation. The U.S. doesn't have a massive federal tax. I think it's still about 18 cents a gallon, which works out to about 4 cents a liter. We have 10 cents a liter. The U.S. doesn't have, in most jurisdictions, a carbon tax. So they're exempt from 17.61 cents a liter plus HST, which they don't have. They don't have an ad valorem tax, which multiplies based on the percentage. And Atlantic Canada 15%, Quebec 14.975, Ontario 13%, and Western Canada 5%. They don't have, to the extent that we do, large provincial taxes, and so that's a big part of the differential. But ultimately, something that we often ignore, and we shouldn't on a day like today. How many pennies does it take to buy a US dollar? 140.1.
Yes.
Canadian dollar, is the benchmark by which we buy all of our commodities. Whether they're made here or they're made abroad, we still pay international price, and that price is in US terms. So let me give you an example. When I do my calculation, and I'm not gonna be too erudite about this, but I do it two ways. One, by computer, but I also write the stuff down every single day. They can see the rack price and whatnot, and so that gives me an idea where we're heading.
You're old school, Dan, just like me. Write a pen and paper.
John, here's the thing. It costs you an extra 25 cents a liter. The biggest tax on gasoline right now, before carbon taxes finally takes over, will be the differential we pay between here and the Americans. It's 24 to 25 cents a liter because the Canadian dollar is not strong compared to the US greenback. There's a whole host of reasons for that. The one I love, block pipelines, your number one export, and you can pretty much imagine what happens. If we didn't have Trans Mountain Pipeline opened up, the new one, I suspect the Canadian dollar would be at $1.50 and 150 pennies to buy $1 US. That would add about 30 cents to the price of gasoline.
So just for our American audience, a liter is approximately 1/4 of a gallon.
3.78541. That's how many liters in the US gallon. And we used to have the imperial gallon, which is 4.55 for the old school types, John?
Yes, yes. So as a rough estimate, 1/4 is pretty close.
Yeah.
So you can multiply the prices we're paying. So let's go through this thought exercise and translate for the American audience what the typical Canadian today is paying per gallon.
Well, if you're an American buying a Canadian fuel, it wouldn't be so bad. But if you're a Canadian in the United States buying Canadian fuel, I mean, you're on a day like today at $1.50. So I'm just going off the top of my head, times 3.8. You're paying about $5.70, $5.80 for a gallon of gasoline. So, and it's much higher in some cases, and that's average in Canada. The average benchmark in Canada is about 148 to 151. There are differences here and there, but that's the price of fuel. And so you can imagine, people say, well, I think I can drive an electric vehicle. We'll get into that a little later on. But, it comes to diesel. You don't have much choice when it comes to jet fuel, which is distillates. You don't have much choice when it comes to mining, forestry, agriculture. Has to be done. And transport, large trucks don't run yet on something other than diesel. So you can imagine those prices are just as high too. Diesel right now is pushing in the $1.58. So you're talking $5.90 a gallon.
So then, in order to help all these impediments in Canada, the current Canadian government, run by Justin Trudeau, has decided to add a carbon tax, and so that's done to help Canadians, right, Dan?
Oh yeah, it really helps them a lot. Look, I've warned people for the past 6 or 7 years that this was not a very bright thing to do. Yeah, when it was 2 or 3 cents a liter, no one really cared. But 17 cents. And there's a second carbon tax, a clean fuel standard, which is now 20 cents a liter in British Columbia because they had their own. They wanted to get ahead of everybody. The Atlantic provinces have an 7 to 8 cent, clean fuel standard. That is not rebated. Of course, the 17.61 plus 15%. You can see how the totality of these things is starting to impact. The date in which the federal government imposed the backstop on both taxes at the same time saw prices in Nova Scotia, for instance, go up about 22, 24 cents a liter. I note at the same time, being 18 years as a member of parliament, the numbers in the polling changed rather dramatically. The Conservatives went way up and the Liberals began their deep descent, which they've never recovered from.
So this carbon tax is meant to solve the issue of climate change. And so how successful has the Trudeau government been in solving the climate change issue in Canada?
Well, I think Jerry DeMarco, the Canadian Climate Commission has come out and said that we're not winning the battle. That in fact, emissions are going up. They haven't stabilized, and we're certainly not going to get back to a reduction of 20 to 30% by 2030, as was always the goal going back to 1997 when we signed the Kyoto Protocol when I was a member of Parliament. So I would say on that scale, it's a complete F, as in a fail. And more importantly, it's left, I think, many Canadians with the feeling that as there is tax cascading, as this tax makes its way throughout the economy, there are impacts that are well beyond those who have imagined this. And while it's considered a matter of effectiveness, and every economist out there says it's a wonderful idea, from an equity point of view, it's harmed the very people who could least afford it, the poor. And I don't say it's the complete thing. I'm working with my friends, Sylvain Charlevoix, on this kind of stuff to provide data and peer-reviewed information that would allow us to make the conclusion that food affordability has also been compromised. It certainly hasn't made life cheaper for people, and keeping prices artificially high when it's more expensive for Americans or less expensive for Americans is something I think many of us are becoming more aware of. It's not perfect in the United States, but in many other of our jurisdictions that we compete with, things are a little bit better.
So can you comment on some of the other so-called green regulations, such as the clean fuel regulations and emission caps? How effective are these measures likely to be?
Well, there are a lot of them, and they come in various forms. The big one was, of course, not the carbon tax, but the actual second carbon tax. And the idea is to between that and something called OBPS, the output-based pricing system, was to go after large emitters of CO2. And if you believe CO2 is the molecule that is bringing life to an end on this planet, then by all means, on that score, I think we failed. We have to probably try another model. But if you, like more and more people are becoming growingly skeptical about the science behind this and the economics that underlies it, then I think increasingly you're seeing why there's a divergence in popular support. What was supportable 5 to 10 years ago is not as supportable today. I think that's not just showing up in terms of polling information, but when it comes down to it, it may be a policy that is going to require a lot more time and a lot more effort. And when a country like Canada, which produces 1.5, 1.6% of global emissions, an energy-intensive country, a country in which many nations are coming knocking on our door, including Germany, including Greece, including Latvia, including South Korea, knocking on our door saying, listen, can you provide our energy? We'd rather buy it from you than Venezuela, Iran, Russia, or take your pick. We have a really good, and I'm not here to champion the oil industry. They don't like me and I don't like them. And it's been like that for many, many years. But let's give credit where credit is due. I mean, Canada has, reduced methane, not great, but it's done what no other country has been able to do in an environmentally sound way. Of course, John, the bigger question for me is, are we talking about environmentalism or are we talking about a tax policy? Because I think in this case, it's very clear to make the argument that carbon taxes and almost our fascination to the exclusion of all other forms of environmental concern has led us, I think, down to a very, very unaffordable path for most Canadians.
Yeah, I just want to jump in here for a quick second, Dan. With regards to, we talked a little bit about it earlier, the Trans Mountain Pipeline. I know that the Trudeau government in Canada here, and same thing in the United States with the Biden administration, they have been vehemently opposed to the implementation and creation of additional pipelines, which would help drive down the cost essentially. And one of the things that you're kind of hitting at here is that these carbon taxes are creating inflationary pressures that are making life as we know it more unaffordable for the average individual, and especially lower income individuals who don't have the ability to absorb some of those pricing hits. Would, in your estimation, what percentage would prices be able to drop if we were to get the appropriate level of pipelines built across North America in order to bring down the transportation costs of moving these fuels around the country?
Well, if Canada had a Keystone XL pipeline, which was killed by the Biden administration on its first act of executive authority in 2021, I suspect that we would probably see the Canadian dollar on par with the United States, with the U.S. greenback. And that would obviously mean a pretty significant savings for most people, not just for fuel, but for every other commodity that we consume. Our purchase power would increase by probably a tenth, maybe even as much as an eighth in terms of everything we purchase. That wouldn't be perfect, but it would go a long way in terms of ensuring that our government wouldn't have to go into debt, some $30 billion to build a pipeline, as it did when Kinder Morgan was prepared to build a Trans Mountain pipeline. But because the federal government would stand by its own permitting approvals process, as we saw with Kinder Morgan, basically frustrated and said, look, we've gone through hoops to make this pipeline. We're building it, but we keep getting objected to, lawfare and all sorts of strategies, which the federal government wasn't prepared to fight as the previous federal government had done. Well, then it put Canadians on the hook because the Canadian government, the Crown, the executive had already said, yes, you can build this, and then turn around and let every Tom, Dick, and Harry organization go out there and take pot shots at it, including the late premier of the province of British Columbia, John Horgan, who said he would use every tool in his toolbox to block the Trans Mountain pipeline. Bottom line, this could have been done, free of any public monies. Now it costs us, $34 billion on the books to build a pipeline that the private sector is prepared to build for nothing, and which would have had the same material benefits, getting 590,000 extra barrels out to the market every day. By the way, that's worth $41 million in economic activity a day to the Canadian economy at $70 a barrel. All of these things could have happened, might have happened, but the lessons learned, I think. There's no doubt in my mind that Alberta, Saskatchewan, parts of British Columbia, and even Newfoundland would have the ability to sell a lot more of this if it weren't for the regulations that are basically aimed at saying, when you have a prime minister saying there's no business case for oil or gas in the world, and the rest of the world scratching his head saying, what great country, but something snapped. What's happened?
Yeah, and I think that's what you see here is the result of ideologically driven thought and legislation as opposed to rationally economically driven decision making. Because as you said, the currency alone in terms of purchasing power, that's a 30% swing in the cost of our dollar relative to the United States. And then you add on top of that the fact that now this is a publicly funded endeavor as opposed to a privately funded endeavor. So taxpayers are now on the hook for additional costs when it comes to borrowing the money associated with building a pipeline of this nature. And so, you just see the incrementally, the additional, piling on top of one poor decision after another. Anyway.
Just along the same vein, and I think we've already dismantled the arguments favoring government intervention in carbon emissions, but the current federal government also has released new regulations on November 4th requiring upstream oil and gas operations to lower their emissions by 35% below 2019 levels, and to do so by 2030, which is only 6 years away, and 2032 at the latest. Like the carbon tax, these types of regulations are more likely to generate. Are they more likely to generate the desired results, or will they only act to further disincentivize competition and Canadian energy production, reduce employment, and increase the cost of energy?
I wrote a blog about this a few weeks ago, John, which appeared in a couple of places, Western Standard, still in affordableenergy.ca. You can see it there. I did another one today on EVs, but we'll discuss that later. I think this is a vindictive move by activists within the Trudeau Liberal cabinet designed to hamstring the ability for an industry that has already proven its credibility in terms of reducing emissions. I mean, methane has dropped more in Canada than it has in the United States and many other jurisdictions around the world where there are no such regulations or restrictions. The effect of what the government is proposing, again, without any cost-benefit analysis, much of what they're saying is, let's put it very bluntly, is a lie. I proved that in the Clean Fuel Standard when they did no similar cost-benefit analysis. For every $1 of cost of benefit was $6 in economic cost to the Canadian economy. That's 6-to-1 negative. So that was just in the Clean Fuel Standard. The emissions cap will drive a wedge in the economic powerhouse of our economy. And, my good friend, neighbor, when I was a child, Doug Ford, can talk a lot about Ontario being the powerhouse, but energy is still our number one export, our most valuable export. It's still 10 to 15% of your GDP. And if you're going to take Alberta and say, hey, you can get rid of 4.5% of GDP, kill the Canadian economy by another 1%, shed what amounts to about $150 billion in revenues over the next 20 years, then good luck with that.
Yeah, then what you're basically saying is the only reason our cost of living here in Canada is as high as it is, and even higher than the cost of living in the US, despite 4 years of mismanagement down there. The principal reason is we're shooting ourselves in the foot.
We're a resource-based economy, John. We are not, yes, we do manufacturing, and yes, we do AI, we do all these wonderful things. But at the end of the day, our bread is buttered with oil and gas and resources and mining and agriculture. And anybody who thinks that it isn't that way, I mean, really needs a very serious lesson in what makes this economy tick. Look, when I wrote my reports in the 1990s, it was always a concern by Kretze, by Martin, and some of the leadership in our party that I wasn't going to go after the upstream of the oil sector. And I asked Paul Martin the question very bluntly in 1998. I said, why are you so concerned about the bloody oil industry? And because they're no friend of mine, I'm no friend of theirs. He says, it's just this simple, Dan. If we want to pay down our debt, which had crippled us badly in the 1990s and made us almost an honorary member of the IMF, we're going to need to sell more oil to the rest of the world, especially the United States, and build those pipelines and get that industry to function. Like it or not, it's the thing that makes your economy tick. It pays your pensions. It pays for our social programs. It used to be the big distinction by which Canadians could always proudly say around the world, our prosperity very much hinges on our ability to sell these resources to the rest of the world, something that has come completely undone over the past few years.
And has been undone by the current regime in Ottawa running the show.
Yes, it has.
Yeah, so that's as far as I'm concerned, that's criminal behavior by the leadership and policymakers in this country. As someone who's experienced in public office, how effective is force feeding a political agenda to your constituents? I think down in the U.S., we've just heard a resounding "it isn't," and they've changed direction. What's your view?
Oh, it's going to be worse in Canada. I've been very blunt about this in places. I believe, and I've shared this with my friend Stephen LeDrew and many others, the longest-serving president of the Liberal Party of Canada, in a debate very recently. I believe the Liberal Party as we knew it is gone, but I think the name Liberal will not be coming around anytime soon. It'll take 2, 3, maybe even 4 elections before they get back into the swing of things. The Liberal Party has tied its fortunes with all sorts of interesting identities, very much the far left, control, suppression. And I think it's just something that's anathema to everything I've understood in my time, going back to when I was 12 and 13 years old, licking stamps, putting up lawn signs, and for Hugh Faulkner in 1974, for Paul Cosgrove in 1978, and for several other cabinet ministers, Liberal members of Parliament, until I finally ran in 1993. This is not my Liberal Party. It is not the traditional Liberal Party, a party that believed very much in social opportunities and improving the opportunity for people, not in socialism. And unfortunately, this party is now tied to socialism. And I think they're, certainly when you talk to Stephen Guilbeault and some of his other ministers who got their first break working in my office, they are committed to the nth degree to socialism. And I think that does not work well for Canada.
I have to, and I don't mean this in a political sense, but I don't understand. And one of the reasons I am so deeply passionate about energy, and I suspect, Dan, this goes into your roots of your being and soul as well, is we all use it. It's all important to us. It's all integral to us. We all need it. Our economy needs it. Our own productivity needs it. So how did we become so divorced from reality in terms of what energy is to us that we allowed ourselves to become deluded by really bad, false economic illusions? That's the thing that has always puzzled me. And listening to this conversation right now, I'm just shaking my head and biting my tongue because I've never understood the logic of course, in the United States, it was like Obama said this at one point. We want to make gas so expensive people won't use it. It's like, well, if there was something else, fine.
That's like bicycle lanes in downtown Toronto.
No,
Yeah, they want to make driving so inconvenient in Toronto that they replace lanes for cars for lanes for bicycles because they don't want people to drive cars. The problem is we don't have an alternative to get around downtown in Toronto. We don't have a subway system that goes everywhere. So people are forced to drive and
yeah, that's it. How do we divorce the reality of our reality from our actual policy and the intent, Dan? I'm curious.
I think personally, and I'll let Dan finish this thought, but I think personally, the people who disseminate information in North America have been disseminating inaccurate information for a good 24 years, and people have been convinced of that alternative viewpoint and think that is the right way for the future. And clearly, in the United States last week, they said, no, we're going back to rational common sense thought. Dan, go ahead and finish that.
Wow. I think it's basically, if I were to do a survey, 2015, 2014, standard living was pretty good. People could take for granted the things that have given us and bequeathed us a fairly, a fairly envious state of affairs for most of us. Governments didn't have problems with debts. They had arrested that in the 1990s. We've had everybody almost full employment. Homes were cheap. Food was cheap. Fuel was something we grumbled about, but it wasn't something that caused us to wake up. And then I say here in my province of Ontario, when we had a provincial progressive Liberal government, which hasn't been restored to power, decided to fool around with green energy and start to ignore the fact that we were a province that brought in nuclear energy long before it was trendy and commercialized it, became the lowest cost jurisdiction for hydro, commercial and otherwise in North America. A lot of people tend to ignore that and say, well, these things just happen to be, we take them for granted. I think things began to change very much pre-COVID and just during COVID when inflation got out of hand. And of course, people tended not to look at, what would happen. What kind of world would we be in if we didn't have natural gas, propane, if we didn't have oil, if we didn't have hydro? So to Bill's point, I think it's very clear that we have significantly underestimated how we got here in a nation which Molière, the great French poet and writer of the 17th century, referred to Canada as quelques arpents de neige et bandes de fléaux, a couple of snowdrifts and just some woods. Nothing serious. This country was very prohibitive. It was a very difficult country to live in prior to the 1950s and the 1940s. We've mastered our resources and as a result created one of the most prosperous, envious places in which to live. Didn't happen by accident. It happened to a large extent by energy, not just an abundance of energy, but affordable, reliable energy, as you said, Bill.
Yeah, and I think just to piggyback off of that, going back to our discussion before we started recording here, was this whole notion of energy is largely ideologically driven, and people forget the fact that in order for any country to modernize and industrialize and get to the point of a first world or country place to live and economy, the major requirement is cheap, affordable, reliable energy. And as where we stand right now, the most important and most reliable forms of energy are, so-called fossil fuels. Like it or not, nuclear energy is a tremendous energy source as well. A lot of people are afraid of nuclear energy for reasons which we may or may not get into later on here. But nuclear energy is a very clean and affordable form of energy. But the fossil fuels represent the greatest opportunity for any country, any major organization to modernize and be able to provide a high standard of living for their citizens. And so to just turn our backs on it for ideological purposes doesn't make a lot of sense, and has really crippled our country as a result.
Just to wrap up this segment, I want to paraphrase the retiring CEO of Toyota Motors, who said that electric vehicles will never replace gasoline-powered vehicles. They may get to 1/3 of the total amount of cars on the road, but we need all sources of energy to power cars. We need gasoline, we need electric, we need hydrogen, and perhaps some other technologies that are currently being worked on. But to think that any one source of energy is going to be the solution to powering vehicles is silly. And that is from one of the largest car manufacturers on the planet.
Number one, yeah. My old company. When Dr. Kito Toyoda made those statements, he was attacked by Wall Street. And it wasn't the Wall Street actors. It was actually the woke capitalists there who were upset that their narrative was failing miserably. The largest company in the world was basically saying, no. They said they'll bring some hydrogen in, they'll bring some electric in. Look, one of the last cut lines I wrote when I was in public relations for Toyota Canada in 1992, 1993 was a little car called the Tsunami. You may not know that car. You'll know today is the Prius. At the time, the cut line, and I got this from Japan, was that the next 50 years, we'll see almost every vehicle use hybrid. The identifier is our future will be in hybrid. It will not be in any other form of energy. And no, they are trying and experimental. What happens in an autoclave? What happens in a widget? What happens, in a setting where you say these are wonderful new technologies with great promise? None of them have been proven, and we're willing to trade away for this term just transition. Look, has been one just transition, a transition. We went from whale oil in the 1850s to real oil. And that's the only time we've seen major transition on a global scale and that has affected humanity. We've also seen the quadrupling of our population. And it's not just oil energy. Think of the Haber-Bosch process by which we put nitrogen in the fields, which quadruples the amount of output for crops, which has made society a lot more livable and food a lot more abundant.
But the government doesn't want to give people nitrogen.
Nitrogen coming from natural gas.
Yeah, that's crazy.
Yes, absolutely. Well, I think this is a good spot to put a pin in the discussion, because our next topic is going to be discussing the electric vehicles, as Dan you started to touch upon there with Toyota. So we'll wrap it up. We'll turn it over to Bill, and then we'll come back for episode 2.
First of all, stick around for episode 2, because boy, it is terrific, and it is more just a simple look at reality in regards to the importance of the energy you use, how it's in everything you buy, the cost of it, and how we're making some really boneheaded, crazy decisions, both in Canada and the United States, in terms of how we're dealing with this. Alex, before we go away and come back for part 2, how do people get a hold of y'all if you're listening to this podcast and they might want to have a conversation with you about financial matters?
Absolutely, Bill. Our website is medwealth.ca. That's med-wealth.ca. That's the one of the best places to go ahead and get a hold of us.
Beautiful. And for those of you listening to the podcast for the first time who are not yet subscribers, hit the follow button. Become a subscriber. That way, every time a new episode of this podcast is dropped, you will be notified. You can give it a listen. And I would also ask that if you like this podcast, if you find it informative, useful, entertaining, tell people about it. Please. Word of mouth promotion is welcome. We thank you for it. Until next time, aka part 2 of this great conversation, I'm Bill Tucker, thanking you on behalf of everybody at MedWealth. I'm wishing you go out today and make today a great day, or not, if you so choose. It is your decision to make. Use it wisely. See you next time.
Thank you for listening to Prescribing Prosperity. Visit our website at med-wealth.ca. That's med-wealth.ca for more information or to connect with us for a consultation. Don't forget to click the follow button to be notified when new episodes become available. The information covered and posted represents the views and opinions of the hosts and their guests and does not necessarily represent the views or opinions of IPC Securities Corporation. The content has been made available for informational and educational purposes only. The content is not intended to be a substitute for professional investment advice. Always seek the advice of a qualified and licensed financial service provider with any questions you may have regarding your investment or retirement planning. MedWealth Financial Services can provide a private consultation to help you determine the suitability of any guidance discussed on the show.